It's 7 p.m. Wednesday, July 24th, here in Seoul.
Coming up on News Center tonight. Russia is changing its story about its aircraft intruding into the East Sea. It had expressed regret before, but it's now blaming South Korea for threatening its aircraft.
Following the airspace intrusion, visiting U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton calls for close cooperation with South Korea over similar situations in the future.
South Korea again asks Japan to withdraw its export restrictions against Seoul and not to go ahead with other new restrictions. Seoul's Trade Ministry says the measures are not only short-sighted but counterproductive.
And the South Korean government allows 7 regions of the country to test innovative technologies without strict regulations. The move is part of efforts to boost Korea's competitiveness in the so-called Fourth Industrial Revolution and improve self-reliance. NEWSCENTER begins now. Good evening and welcome to Arirang News Center, coming to you live from Seoul. I'm Noadam.
And I'm Lee Ji-yoon. It's great to have you with us. Seoul's Defense Ministry has rejected what it's saying are distorted claims by Russia regarding Tuesday's intrusion into Korea's airspace.
Let's get more details from our Kim Ji-yeon, who's standing by at Seoul's Defense Ministry. Ji-yeon, what's the latest?
Well, I'll tell you this first. Russia's stance on this unprecedented intrusion into South Korea's airspace has shifted in the space of a day. Seoul's Defense Ministry said Wednesday that Russia had claimed its military aircraft did not intrude into South Korea's airspace, but that it was actually South Korea's Air Force and its pilots that impeded the Russian plane's flight course with, quote, threatening and unprofessional gestures. This was relayed from the military attaché office of the Embassy of Republic of Korea in Russia. In response, the ministry said Russia has distorted the facts and has deviated from the view expressed Tuesday by a military officer summoned from Russia's embassy in Seoul. The ministry said it has clear evidence to prove that a pair of Tu-95 bombers did trespass into Korea's air defense identification zone, the Cadiz, and that a Russian A-50 aircraft intruded into the East Sea twice near Dokdo Island. It says South Korea's Air Force acted accordingly to protocol by giving numerous audio warnings and intercepting the Russian plane to keep it from advancing further and later on firing warning shots. The ministry said it plans to confirm this through working-level talks with Russia, which the Defense Ministry has just confirmed. It will be held in ministry's compounds, but that the time and exact location are yet to be announced. It added it cannot readily accept Russia's explanation that the, quote, intrusion was caused by a technical glitch and that this problem is what likely caused the aircraft to intrude into areas it had not planned to go. You'll notice that the Russian military officer had acknowledged on Tuesday afternoon that it was actually an intrusion into South Korean airspace, but now this afternoon, Russia is blaming the South Korean military.
Right, so that's quite a switch in stance from Moscow. What's Seoul's Defense Ministry's response to Russia's new claim?
Well, a defense ministry official rejected that new claim, saying that if the Russian plane had stayed on a normal course, it would have no reason to encroach on Korea's airspace because it would have a navigational system such as GPS. The ministry said the Russian military official that was summoned after the incident has said Russia would immediately launch a probe and take necessary steps so that such an incident does not happen again. Seoul's Defense Ministry is reviewing whether to share information with Russia about the plane in question. Earlier in the day, Senior Cheongwon Secretary for Public Communication Yoon Do-won cited a Russian military attaché saying the Russian side had explained that Tuesday's flight was planned in advance jointly with China, and that if it went according to its original plan, the intrusion into Korean airspace and entering Korea's air defense identification system Cadiz zone would not have occurred. And the ministry responded that it's considering to what extent it'll share related information following Russia's claim that it would be helpful in resolving the situation if Seoul gave the exact timing of the airspace intrusion, coordinates, and photos taken by Korea's Air Force. Back to you.
Now, South Korea's political parties have condemned the flights by the Chinese and Russian military aircraft in one voice, but they had different diagnoses of the situation. The parties demanded that China and Russia officially apologize to South Korea and promised that such incidents will not happen again. But the main opposition Liberty Korea party blamed the South Korean government for the incident, saying it had neglected Korea's partners and allies. The centrist 바른미래 party also pointed its finger at the Moon administration for neglecting diplomatic and security affairs. In response, the ruling Democratic Party criticized the opposition for trying to use national security affairs for politics. U.S. President's National Security Advisor promised to keep close ties with South Korea in the face of such further potential airspace breaches. Now, apart from that, the security chiefs of Seoul and Washington discussed a range of issues, including the Korean peace process. Our Shin Se-min has more.
Both South Korea and the U.S. have agreed on close cooperation following the unprecedented violation of Korean airspace by Russia and the entering of Korea's air defense identification zone, known as KADIS, by both Russian and Chinese military warplanes early Tuesday. According to a readout by the presidential spokesperson, Seoul's National Security Advisor Chung Eui-yong explained the severity of the recent airspace violation to his visiting American counterpart, John Bolton. And to that, the American official responded by calling for the two nations' tight consultation in order to be able to prevent similar situations from happening again in the future. The two also reassured their close ties in dealing with the Korean peace process, referring to the promise made by the leaders of North Korea and the U.S. last month at the inter-Korean border. Chung and Bolton shared an understanding that working-level talks should resume immediately. Holding separate meetings with South Korea's security chief, the defense minister, and the top diplomat, Bolton reassured the two sides' strong ties.
So there are many challenges out there, some in this part of the world, some in other parts of the world, but I'm confident that ROK and U.S. will work very closely together to resolve them.
Apart from security-related issues in the region, the two security chiefs also promised to continue consultations on the U.S.-driven efforts to ensure free navigation in the Strait of Hormuz, as Washington had been working to build a multinational force to safeguard commercial shipping in that area. But no mention of the dispatch of Korean troops to the region was made. Asked for the issue of defense cost sharing starting the year 2020, the allies agreed to continue discussions in the most reasonable and fair way. And contrary to what many expected, Bolton's meeting with high-level officials in South Korea didn't result in any significant conclusion to Tokyo's retaliatory trade curbs against Seoul, at least according to the press release. Bolton left the door open by saying that both Seoul and Tokyo maintain close cooperation, likewise with their allies, Washington, and that could be an unspoken push for both South Korea and Japan in extending their bilateral deal on exchanging military information. Shin Se-min, Arirang News.
Now, sticking with that trade spat, Seoul's Trade Ministry has again urged Tokyo to withdraw its export curbs against Korea and not to go ahead with further restrictions. Today is the last day that Japan is accepting feedback before it decides whether to take Korea off its so-called white list of trading partners. Yoon Jung-min reports.
South Korea's Trade Ministry submitted an opinion to Japan on Wednesday, again urging Tokyo to take back its export curbs and not to exclude South Korea from the 27 countries on its so-called white list who receive preferential treatment on trade.
Japan should immediately retract its groundless export restrictions on the three items related to semiconductors. Also, Japan should withdraw its move to revise the trade law to take South Korea off its white list. Companies and people in both countries do not want to break South Korea and Japan's win-win economic ties, which have lasted more than 60 years, because of this issue.
Removal would mean Japanese exporters have to apply for approval to ship goods to South Korea on a case-by-case basis. The ministry added that it hopes to maintain a future-oriented relationship with Tokyo and is fully ready to talk. The government refuted Japan's claims one by one. It said South Korea has always properly managed its own controls on exports to North Korea based on a catch-all system involving relevant government institutions and experts, a system it said is stricter than Japan's. Furthermore, Japan's argument is false, it said, because it fails to understand South Korea's tight system of control over strategic and non-strategic goods. It went on to say that Seoul has kept its dialogue channels with Tokyo open. Japan had cited a lack of communication as another reason for the curbs, but last year, the 7th high-level talks between Seoul and Tokyo were postponed with the agreement of both sides because Japan also understood it was not easy for them to adjust the schedule. The Trade Ministry also said Japan's latest moves go against the WTO's principles of free trade and are short-sighted because they will hurt Japanese companies and the global supply chain. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, discussions at the WTO over Japan's trade restrictions have been delayed, with officials from both sides prepared to make their case. Observers, including Japanese media, say it might not be easy to justify Tokyo's reasons for placing export curbs on South Korea. Oh Soo-young explains.
What Japan may claim as security reasons for its export restrictions on South Korean companies may be difficult to prove to the World Trade Organization's decision-making body. Tokyo had cited distrust in Korea's management of dual-use technologies as its reason for restricting exports of core semiconductor materials. But observers, including US tech groups and global media, point out the lack of concrete evidence for those claims.
Well, they certainly have taken a page from Trump. Trump has been using national security reasons for a lot of his protectionist actions, principally because the WTO has generally allowed national security exceptions. I think most people would agree that Japan isn't that concerned about dual-use technology.
The Japanese daily Nihon Keizai Shimbun reported Wednesday that there's been criticism of the vagueness of Tokyo's claims against Korea and the, quote, inadequate case for enacting export curbs in an opaque way. The paper also said if the WTO panel sees the measures as an act of political retaliation rather than trade control, the odds would be in Korea's favour. Most observers believe it's clear that Japan is not genuinely concerned about export controls.
The intentions are more about trying to encourage different behavior from the Republic of Korea in terms of trying to get them to see more eye to eye with the Japanese government's position that the historical past is closed and there should not be further recourse through the courts against individual Japanese companies for forced labor and crimes that were committed during the colonial period.
Ahead of the WTO's General Council meeting on Wednesday, Seoul Senior Trade Representative Kim Seung-ho has argued that Tokyo is already violating WTO regulations with its export curbs. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT, prohibits WTO member countries from restricting exports. Kim will likely cite this provision. And Japan's move to take South Korea off its trade whitelist could be seen as violating the rule of giving equal treatment to all other WTO countries. Depending on the results of Wednesday's meeting, Seoul plans to decide whether to file a complaint with the WTO. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News.
6 US business groups have sent an open letter to Korea and Japan urging a timely resolution to their ongoing trade dispute. Organizations including the National Association of Manufacturers and the Semiconductor Industry Association sent the letter to the trade ministers of Seoul and Tokyo on Tuesday. The letter states that the trade dispute could lead to a potential supply chain collapse and delays in imports and exports, which would harm the global economy. Meanwhile, South Korea's Trade Minister Yoo Myung-hee is visiting Washington this week to meet American economic and trade experts. She will likely highlight that Tokyo's export curbs are unfair and that they will hurt the world economy. Meanwhile, South Korea's parliament is also working to resolve the trade conflict with Japan. A delegation of lawmakers is on its way to the US for talks with American officials, with another group headed for Japan next week. Kim Mo-kyun reports.
A parliamentary delegation led by former National Assembly Speaker Chung Se-kyun of the ruling Democratic Party is visiting Washington for 5 days until Sunday. The 7-member team will meet with senators from the upper and lower house as well as high-ranking State Department officials to explain that Japan's export restrictions against South Korea are unjust. The delegation will also deliver a unanimous resolution adopted by Foreign Affairs and Unification Committee lawmakers earlier this week, which mainly calls for Japan to withdraw the curbs.
Alongside the delegation to the U.S., another group of lawmakers led by independent lawmakers Ho Chung-won is set to visit Japan for 2 days beginning July 31st. Though the other participants are yet to be confirmed, the delegation is expected to meet with Japanese counterparts to argue for the withdrawal of Japan's export curbs against Korea, as well as discuss ways to mend the worsening ties between the two countries. Ahead of the visits, National Assembly Speaker Moon Hee-sang sent letters to his U.S. and Japanese counterparts on Tuesday, stating his concerns about Tokyo's export restrictions. In his letter to the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives Nancy Pelosi, Moon expressed hopes for Washington to mediate in the row, and in his letter to Japan's House of Representatives Speaker Tadamori Oshima, Moon called for Japan to refrain from taking additional measures and work to resolve the issue diplomatically. Kim Mo-kyun, Arirang News.
Now, as we have reported this week, many Koreans have cancelled their travel plans to Japan as part of a massive boycott of Japanese products in South Korea. But this is having a knock-on effect on South Korea's aviation industry. Lee Min-sun explains.
The boycott of Japanese products in South Korea has accelerated ever since the trade spat between the two countries blew up earlier this month. More and more South Koreans are canceling pre-booked trips to Japan and are encouraging others to do the same online. A local branch of Korea's National Agricultural Cooperative Federation even ran a special campaign giving away 10 kilograms of rice to those who called off their trip to Japan. With the swelling number of cancellations, South Korea's low-cost carriers are either canceling or slashing the number of routes or the regularity of their flights to Japanese cities. Starting September, Air Busan, a subsidiary of Asiana Airlines, will discontinue its daily route from Korea's southern city of Daegu to Tokyo's Narita Airport and cut in half its flights between Daegu and Osaka. EasterJet will also scrap routes to two Japanese cities from Busan in September. Jin Air and T-Way Air have made similar decisions. Many existing air routes to Japanese cities run by the low-cost carriers weren't that popular in the first place and weren't bringing in substantial profits. With the boycott, airlines are adjusting their routes and are seeking to diversify their international destinations.
Demand for Japanese routes has been decreasing since the turn of the year. The trade dispute just accelerated the reorganization of routes to Japan.
Japan's major tourist hubs are also feeling the heat. Tsushima Island, located about halfway between the Korean peninsula and Japan, used to be a popular tourist destination for South Koreans. Some 600,000 Koreans visited the island last year by ferry, but stores that were once packed with tourists now sit empty and the street deserted. The impact is already being felt less than a month into the boycott, and if it continues to expand and intensify, there's no guessing the effect it will have on both countries' economies. Lee Min-sun, Arirang News.
In other news, Seoul's Unification Ministry has confirmed Russian news reports that South Korean and Russian sailors are being detained by Pyongyang for accidentally entering North Korean waters. Our Lee Ji-won with the details.
2 South Koreans and 15 Russians are being held captive by North Korea after their fishing ship broke down and drifted into the North waters. Russian media reported on the incident earlier this week, and an official at South Korea's Unification Ministry confirmed the news on Wednesday. The official said both South Korean sailors in their 50s and 60s are safe and well and are currently staying in a hotel in the city of Wonsan as they are being investigated together with the rest of the crew, as confirmed by the Russian authorities. The ship, identified as the Russian-flagged Shanghai Lin 8, left South Korea's northeastern port of Sokcho on July 16th and was heading for the Russian port of Zarubino when its engine malfunctioned. The North Korean border guards seized the ship, accusing the vessel of violating the rules of entry and stay in the territory, and had the sailors detained on July 17th. The ship is currently at a port in Wonsan. Through the Inter-Korean Liaison Office, South Korea last week requested updates from North Korea on the current status of the 2 Koreans. A day later, Seoul again requested the information through Korean Red Cross, but it's reported that Pyongyang still hasn't replied as of Wednesday afternoon. Seoul's Unification Ministry officials said it is in close contact with Russia to receive updates on the matter and have its people return back safely. The Russian embassy in Pyongyang said on Monday that Russian consular officials were allowed to meet with the crew and that it's in constant contact with the North Koreans to resolve the situation. There have been similar cases with South Korean vessels in 2010 and 2017. Sailors of both ships were detained and investigated until they were released after 31 days and 7 days respectively. 이지원, Arirang News.
The South Korean government and the WFP have been working to provide 50,000 tons of rice aid to North Korea by September. But that plan could face difficulties, as the North recently expressed what's being reported as a negative view of the plan. Our Oh Jung-hee reports.
North Korea might be planning to reject rice aid from South Korea, blaming an upcoming Seoul-Washington joint military exercise. On Wednesday, South Korea's Unification Ministry said it learned through the WFP that the North showed a, quote, negative response about receiving 50,000 tons of rice from South Korea. Pyongyang cited the South Korea-U.S. joint military exercise scheduled to take place next month.
We learned recently through consultations between the WFP and North Korea that there are such views in the North. The government is currently trying to figure out the North's official stance through the WFP.
Seoul doesn't see this as Pyongyang's official stance. The view was only expressed at a working-level meeting, not delivered via an official channel.
It is not appropriate for us to prejudge what's going to happen and to tell you what we do if the North clearly rejects the aid. But the government hopes the aid can be delivered on a humanitarian and fraternal basis to resolve the difficulties North Koreans face.
In light of the North's worst food crisis in 10 years, Seoul had planned to provide 50,000 tons of rice to the regime by September this year and hoped to make the first shipment this month. Negotiations have been underway between the WFP and the U.S. on the exemptions that will be needed in terms of sanctions, and the WFP had started accepting bids from companies to carry out the delivery. It was the first rice aid to be sent from the South to the North in 9 years. The North denounced Seoul and Washington for scheduling joint military exercise and has shown no signal of holding working-level denuclearization talks with the U.S. Now, with Seoul's food aid on the verge of being canceled, Seoul says the atmosphere on the Korean peninsula has stiffened, but it still hopes to send cross-border aid as soon as possible. Oh Jung-hee, Arirang News.
The South Korean government has announced that it will allow 7 regions to test innovative technologies without strict regulations. With hopes of making Korea competitive in the fourth industrial revolution, President Moon emphasized on creating an environment where local firms would keep their businesses in the country and not move them abroad. Our Park Hee-jun reports.
President Moon Jae-in says regulatory innovation is a matter of survival in the fourth industrial revolution. He underlined the importance of creating an environment that encourages the fastest development and use of new technology to make South Korea the world's most innovative economy.
산업화 시대의 규제 혁신은 선택의 문제였지만 업종과 권력이 융합하는 4차 산업혁명 시대의 규제 혁신은 생존의 문제입니다.
The president was speaking at a gathering of governors and top officials from across the country in the southern port city of Busan on Wednesday. The government announced the same day a new plan that frees 7 regions from regulations. These areas will be exempt from 58 regulations and will be able to test their innovative technologies without regulation for 2 years. These areas include Busan, focusing on blockchain technology, and Sejong City, focusing on automated driving technology. South Korea is the first country in the world to take such measures. President Moon explained that the steps are necessary to prevent domestic firms from moving their businesses overseas due to strict regulations. He called on regional governments to support the global launch of products and services based on those technologies.
우리의 경쟁 상대는 글로벌 시장입니다. 해외로 가는 국내 기업의 발걸음을 돌리고 외국의 우수한 기업과 자본을 유치할 수 있는 보다 과감한 규제 개선과 지원 방안이 마련되어야 할 것입니다.
Also pointing to the effects that the U.S.-China trade war and Japan's export regulations are having on Korea's major industries, President Moon emphasized that all regions need to pull together. The president also reiterated the importance of strengthening local firms' competitiveness in high-tech materials and diversifying imports. It's not an easy path for sure, but he made it clear that it's the path that must be taken in the fourth industrial revolution. Park Hee-jun, Arirang News.
The ongoing U.S.-China trade war, as well as uncertainties lingering over Brexit, are some of the reasons as to why the International Monetary Fund had to cut its global growth forecast for this year and the next. Our Lee Seung-jae explains.
In its latest World Economic Outlook report Tuesday, the IMF cut its forecast for global growth in 2019 and 2020, sending a warning that the U.S.-China tariff spat and Brexit could lead to a further slowdown, weakened investment, and a disruption to global supply chains. According to the IMF, downside risks have intensified, and it now expects global growth to be 3.2% this year and 3.5% next year, a decrease of 0.1 percentage point for both years from its previous forecast in April. The IMF's latest downgrade is the fourth cut since October. The global lender says economic data so far this year and softening inflation point to weaker than expected activity, with trade and technology tensions adding to the bleak forecast. The IMF also slashed its forecast for global trade growth by 0.9 percentage point to 2.5% for this year, but said trade growth should rebound to 3.7% in 2020. But that's still 0.2 percentage point under its previous forecast. However, the IMF paints a rosier picture for advanced economies such as the United States. The IMF raised its forecast for the U.S. to 2.6% in 2019, but left its 2020 forecast unchanged at 1.9%. The IMF also upgraded its global forecast for the Eurozone to 1.6% in 2020, leaving its 2019 outlook unchanged at 1.3%. The IMF urged countries to work at the multilateral level to reduce trade tensions, also calling for efforts to ensure the continued enforcement of existing World Trade Organization rules. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
What's old is new again, as they say, and the younger generation here in Korea is apparently falling in love for the fashion and culture of a century ago. And our Kim Hae-sung tells us more about this new up-and-coming trend called neutro.
A combination of the words new and retro, neutro refers to a new interpretation of retro culture. Neutro is growing in popularity across the retail industry, with those in their teens and 20s spreading neutro-related goods or experiences on Instagram. In Ulji로 in downtown Seoul, there are more than a dozen boutique shops that sell dresses, suits, and other clothes and accessories from the late 19th to early 20th century, or the so-called Enlightenment period in Korea.
The first shop opened late last year thanks to the popularity of Korean dramas like Mr. Sunshine that showcased 90s culture. The dresses became popular among women in their 20s, and it has continued this year. The number of boutique shops is continuing to grow as demand from people in their 30s and 40s is also rising.
Old buildings in Ulji로 have been renovated into restaurants and stores, combining modern facilities and products with traditional interior design. This cafe is decorated in the style of the 1900s, and the wooden tables, ceilings, teapots, and mirrors look traditional.
I like how it's traditional tea, but it's served in these iced glasses. It's interesting. We've heard of the 1900s lifestyle, but I've never experienced it myself. I was always curious about it, and it's nice to try something like this.
Neutro is a new interpretation of the past. It triggers nostalgia from the older generation and weighs on curiosity who wants something new, hip from the younger generation. For businesses, products are flooding the market, and there's a limit to new content, so this neutro really hits the demand.
This neutro trend has also hit the food and beverage industry and even the global game industry, with Nintendo and Tencent coming up with retro games like Super Mario Bros. Seizing the interest of both the older and younger generation, experts say the neutro trend will likely continue to evolve and last for some time. Kim Hae-sung, Arirang News.
Almost 9 out of 10 South Koreans traveled within the country at least once last year. The survey conducted by Seoul's Tourism Ministry also showed each person went on an average of 7 domestic trips during 2018. South Koreans typically spent 12 days on domestic travel. The average spending on domestic trips was around $800. The survey showed about 20% of South Koreans traveled abroad last year. Train ticket sales for this year's Korean Thanksgiving holiday, or Chuseok, will open from August 20th. Tickets for routes on the Gyeongbu, Chungbuk and Donghae lines can be purchased from that date. Honam, Jeollak, Gangneung and other lines will be available from the 21st. Tickets can be purchased online or at train stations nationwide. Details are available on the Korail website. The Seoul Metropolitan Government is designating a 17th century quarry as part of the city's cultural heritage. The quarry was found around 3 years ago and contains an inscription showing that the stone from it was used to build a royal tomb during the Joseon dynasty. The quarry is located in northern Seoul on Bukhansan Mountain, where the inscription says its stone was not to be used without permission. The 2 massive earthquakes that hit California recently have sparked more than 80,000 aftershocks in the Ridgecrest area since July 4th. Experts say the aftershock sequence from the 6.4 and 7.1 tremors is starting to slow down. The Ridgecrest earthquakes are especially worrying as they are relatively close to the Kozo volcanic field, one of America's largest producers of geothermal power. Officials said the aftershocks have been creeping into areas close to 2 major earthquake faults, which could lead to a quake of magnitude 8 or higher. That has been your 3-minute news flash.
It's been stuffy and hot here in Seoul all day as humid weather continues in Korea.
We are also expecting the last of the monsoon rains soon, but it's forecast to be a heavy one. For more details, let's turn to our Michelle Park at the Weather Center. Michelle.
Now, showers have been coming down, making the weather very humid, but it also brought the heat down, meaning most of the heat wave alerts have been lifted. Now, also, we are expecting more monsoon rain in the western provinces starting tonight. The rain will move towards the northern provinces by tomorrow. And meanwhile, island of Jeju will remain under some cloudy skies. Now, the upper half of the country is expected to get the most amount of precipitation this time, especially the southern parts of Gyeonggi-do and also Gangwon-do provinces, with some 400 millimeters of precipitation or even more expected to fall throughout the weekend. And temperatures won't drop significantly during the night, with most of the nation waking up to at least 24 degrees Celsius tomorrow. And as for the daily highs, Seoul will reach up to 29 degrees, while Daegu and Gyeongju will remain high up to 33 and 34 degrees Celsius. Now, during the rain, temperatures won't rise significantly, which will drag the daily highs a couple of notches down and keep tropical nights off the weather forecast, at least for now. Now, I'll leave you with the weather conditions for around the world.
That will do it for this edition of Arirang News. Thank you, as always, for watching.
News in Depth is next.